Good evening, parents. We're super happy to have you here. I am Deborah Porter, Coach Deborah with the Washington Parent and the parent advice column that we offer on Washington Parent. We're super excited to be here this evening and to offer this very important discussion and this very important live with these very amazing experts to give us some perspective and some idea about executive functioning, how it may be impacting our children, and probably most importantly, what it is we can do about it and how we can help them. And so right now, what I would like to do, I would like to have everyone to introduce themselves. So I'm going to start with Lynn Cannon. Lynn, welcome. Would you let everybody know who you are, where you work, what you do, and what you hope to give the parents this evening?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Lynn Cannon. I am the social learning coordinator at the Ivy Mount School and the Maddox School in Rockville, Maryland. And in that role, I provide social and emotional support to the students in our programs. I also help the parents and the teachers in developing and creating strategies and developing skill sets that we can use both in the classroom and at home. I am also the author of the Unstuck and On Target curriculum. That's a curriculum that we developed for elementary school age children to target flexibility, goal setting, planning, organization, and problem solving. I'm excited to report that we also have the preschool version, the middle school version, and the high school version, which are either in press or at the end stages of development right now. So those will be available really soon as well. In addition to the curricula that we've developed, we've also developed a parent guide. It's called Solving Executive Function Challenges, and that's to support parents in managing and developing skill sets related to executive function skills at home. And then most recently, we've developed a set of free parent videos that also target individual executive function skills and are available for everyone. So I think that covers it. I'm excited to be here.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, and I'm excited to share practical strategies that we can take from here and implement either in a classroom or a home setting.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you for those free resources too. That's always very helpful. Dr. Jennifer Reisman, happy to have you. Would you offer the same information, please?
Great, and really pleasure to be here with this fantastic group of folks and talking to parents, which is something I really enjoy. So I'm Dr. Jen Reisman. I am a board certified clinical and pediatric neuropsychologist at the Chesapeake Center for ADHD Learning, Emotional, and Behavioral Health, which has locations across Maryland and in the DC metro area. One of the things that I bring to this discussion tonight about executive functioning is the perspective as a neuropsychologist. So I really specialize in brain behavior relationships. And we know when we're talking about executive functioning, and know we've got fantastic experts here on the behavior front. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the brain front and brain side of things. And we do a lot of assessment work in terms of helping families, and particularly families who are worried about their children's executive functioning. When is it getting into a disorder? And so we'll be talking about that a little bit tonight, and I'll be sharing my perspective on that, what we can do when we've got concerns about our children. And I'll also be sharing some perspective for parents in terms of how we can help develop those skills and different mile markers that we can be looking for in our children, because that's really important to know. When is this something we should be worried about, or when is this kind of typical development and going to see improvement? Because we know that we all see challenges on our way to improvement. So I'm excited to be here tonight talking with everybody and bringing a neuropsychologist perspective.
Thank you so much. We're so happy to have you. Carrie Heller, thank you so much for being here. Will you share a little bit about you and what you do?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks a lot for having me. Happy to be here. I'm Dr. Carrie Heller. I'm a clinical psychologist and founding partner of the Heller Psychology Group in Bethesda, which is a small boutique private practice. I can actually do a lot of telehealth these days and can see clients throughout Maryland, DC, Virginia, and about 24 other states. So it definitely keeps me busy. I specialize in ADHD and executive function issues. I do formal testing, therapy, EF coaching, often blended with traditional therapy, and run an executive function bootcamp. Definitely happy to be here. In terms of resources, I definitely like to share a lot of practical stuff. And one of the biggest things I've found with executive functioning work is that it's often the simplest strategies that work the best, but they have to be the right ones. because one size does not fit all. So tonight, I think you'll definitely hear a lot about, hopefully some very practical stuff that you guys can take home. Although I guess you guys are probably actually already home, but since it's virtual, but in any event, looking forward to sharing some useful information tonight.
Thank you so much. We're all really eager to hear that useful information. So we're happy to have you. And Wendy Weinberger, so happy to have you as well. Will you share a little bit about where you are right now?
Sure. Thank you guys so much for including me in this. I love working with these folks, and these are all great experts. I feel honored to be on the panel with. So thank you. So I am Wendy Weinberger. I'm the co-founder, one of the co-founders and president of Aluminos Academic Coaching and Tutoring, where we specialize in executive functioning coaching. We work in particular with students to find the right coach match for them. So we specialize in spending a lot of time with parents and kids on the front end to make sure that we know what's going on, what are the goals, how can we really assist, not only support the student, but the family as well by finding the right coach to support each student individually. And then we get to know our families and our students really well. We work for an extensive amount of time with them, and we graduate students out because the goal is not for us to go to college with kids, but instead get them building those routines and automaticity so that they can actually do it on their own. And mom and dad don't have to do it, and we don't have to do it, and they can be successful humans, not only in school, but also in life later on. And so we also offer some free resources, as many as we can through our social media, actually. Aluminos, I think _coaching and Aluminos coaching on Instagram and Facebook. And we try to provide, for example, when Carrie offers things, we try to promote that. We love working with Carrie. And if Jennifer's doing anything, or you're doing anything, Deborah or Lynn, basically trying to share with the folks out there, free information, free webinars. We do a monthly series on Less Stress Parenting, and it's all about how can we help you be more supported as a parent. But really we focus on bringing others into the group so that everybody can hear from the wealth of the village out there to support you.
This is going to be such a great discussion because you're the experts in this field. And so I think it's really important that parents know that and understand that this evening, and know that this is just a great opportunity for them to get their questions answered. And, some parents may be here because they've heard this term and it's already been maybe said that their child may be struggling here. Other parents may be here out of curiosity, wondering, I wonder if this is what we're dealing with. So Lynn, I'm going to start with you. Can you just tell us, what is executive functioning? What is that?
Absolutely. So executive function are those high-level mental processes. And I raise my hand to the front of the head because it's right here in the frontal lobe that these skills and these brain processes are developing. They start developing from a very young age, and they develop all the way through our mid-20s. I like to think of executive functions as the conductor of our brain. It is our initiation, our ability to initiate a task. It's our ability to hold something in our memory or our working memory. It's our ability to regulate our emotions. It's our ability to flexibly think about something, organize ourselves and our environment, and also to self-monitor, to regulate those behaviors or to reflect on how something has gone and to change it moving forward. So that encompasses our ability to set goals, to plan, to shift when a plan might not be going the way that we want it to. And so if we think about all of those functions and the impact that has across our entire day, from the moment we wake up in the morning to, getting ourselves to breakfast. And if something interferes with that kind of traditional process that we move through from day to day, we may have to shift gears. The weather changed, we require a different outfit, or we can't find our keys, or we forget our coffee. It's that ability to kind of shift and think flexibly in those moments and get from point A to point B. And that's a pretty taxing set of skills and set of demands on our everyday. And so that's
very helpful. That's really helpful. Wendy, let me ask you, can you share with us what might be a couple of signs that this particular area is having some issues or some struggles, right? What are some signs that this is just not connecting and it's not happening as smoothly as it should be?
Sure, absolutely. With students in school, it's typical that they forget things at school that they're supposed to bring home, or they forget things at home that they're supposed to bring to school. They think they have no homework. They don't check their portals. They don't write down things in school and bring it home and have a process. Really, this is executive functioning is about a process. And I love how Lynn described it as the conductor in the brain. The other way we describe it very similarly is that it's the airport control center, right? So just like at an airport control center, you have that tower up high that's trying to control who's landing, who's driving around on the ground, who's flying over, who's just passing by. All of those things have to happen at once, and it's a complex set of processes that allows that to happen. And so when there's no process in place, as Lynn said, you get interrupted on something and you forget, or you don't go back to having that plan in effect. So a lot of times with students, you see it where they don't think they have homework, or they get to school and they're like, Mom, I forgot my lunch, or Mom, I forgot this paper. Or they don't study and they show up and they're shocked, or they study the wrong things because they don't really know what to study. So we're really looking at students. You see it show up a lot in school, but you'll also see it at home where, Johnny will go to a friend's house and leave his coat every single time, or run out of the house, no joke, without shoes on. So, it's those kinds of things that can be problematic. Sometimes it's just a one-time thing, but when you start to see it over and over and systematically through a period of time. Also, if your child is struggling in class, and it's not just one class, like where you see them actually struggling in multiple classes, and you know that they're capable and not sure why they're struggling so much across the board, a lot of times that shows that there's actually an executive function problem rather than them not understanding the information. It's more about how to handle and manage all of that information in order to understand and get through the process of school.
I wish I knew you all about 10 years ago. We have one of our kids just recently got diagnosed with this particular problem or issue or concern. But now that I look back, it wasn't new. It was just all these little things. And we just had a hard time really realizing that they were all so connected, right? How do you leave out the house in the morning with a coat and it's 5 degrees and you come home without a coat? Like, it just was like one of those weird things. It was like, you forgot your coat. Oh, okay. So this is going to be really helpful for a lot of families. Dr. Reisman, let me ask you this, because many of us are very, very familiar with ADHD, maybe more recently familiar with executive functioning. Can you explain the difference, maybe some of the overlap, maybe where it is similar, but can you kind of pull these two things apart for us so that we understand that they do sometimes even stand on their own?
Right. So one of the things, I'm so happy that when you organize this panel, you set us up to talk about executive functions. And executive functions are those big skills, right, that Lynn talked about. However, we know that ADHD is a clinical disorder. So ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And there's different, kind of presentations of ADHD that we can see. There's an inattentive type of it. There's a impulsive hyperactive type of it. And there's also a combined type of it where we see difficulties with inattention as well as with that impulsivity or the difficulty putting on the brakes onto some of our actions or behaviors. And sometimes you can see those things co-occurring together. A lot of times when that reaches a level where it's interfering with a child's day-to-day life or an adult's day-to-day life, let's also not forget that adults have ADHD and that there's lots of us out there as parents with attentional difficulties that may not have gotten identified when you were younger, but then you're looking at the difficulties that a child has and then getting identified. Really not uncommon for us to hear parents talk about and say, wow, it was amazing to go through this process and find out kind of this root of my child's difficulties because it helps me to understand either maybe some family members or a spouse. But when ADHD, when we talk about those terms, that's really the clinical disorder term that we apply to it. Executive functioning skills can be an area of weakness in lots of different clinical disorders. Autism, learning disabilities, ADHD, even anxiety and depression can impact our ability to have good executive functioning skills. So executive functioning skills really cross-cut so many different areas, but where we see them particularly kind of act up and cause some difficulty in our day-to-day lives is really a lot with ADHD. And I think that's where our therapists in particular are really great with developing some strategies across different disorders and across different conditions that can come into a clinician's office like mine. But in day-to-day life, really executive functioning skills are some of those, what I like to call sometimes like the weak links. When we don't get a good night of sleep, that's when sometimes our planning skills or our ability to stop ourselves from saying that inappropriate comment are going to be a little bit more challenging.
Very helpful. And Carrie, I want to get you in on this. So a parent has asked if we could explain again what executive function is. So if you could do that kind of in your words, and if you could also tell us from what you do and in your practice, do you see these, that EF and ADHD, do you see them together a lot? Are they diagnosed usually? Is there one, or do they kind of travel around together?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to answer those questions. So in terms of giving another definition of executive functioning, essentially it's a set of mental processes that are involved in many actions, pretty much like thinking about start to finish for a project. So thinking about even just, or an activity, think about even logging on tonight. What were the steps you had to take? So you probably had to think to yourself, there was this talk I was going to attend. When was it? Should I look at my calendar? Maybe you got an alert. And then you had to figure out where is the link. And then if you've never watched the Facebook Live before, you had to figure out, how do I actually access it once I get online? So essentially taking all those steps together. Or another thing, I don't know, I like cars a lot. So think about like a car factory. So a car factory, you're going to have robots that are putting together different parts of the car. Maybe they're, putting together the wheels and the windshield and all different parts, but there's a control room that's essentially making the machinery work together. And so that's essentially executive functioning, is all the different pieces working together to either create a finished product or complete a task or take some action. I mean, everyone uses executive function skills on a daily basis. I mean, you obviously don't think about it a lot, but I mean, you really can't do anything without executive functioning. In terms of ADHD and overlap, I mean, it's fascinating to think about it. And I feel like even my own experiences working with people and, I write a lot, so things like that. I don't know, I've definitely like learned a lot about executive functioning, just the relationship. And, I think my understanding of it's changed over the years too. But like, I really view it as, think about ADHD. So it's really in a lot of ways a sort of self-regulation. So self-regulation of attention, hyperactivity, impulsivity. Pretty much if you have ADHD by default, like I would view it, and some people may disagree on this, but I would view it that you by default have executive function weaknesses. Because, we think about someone who has a hard time focusing, difficulty shifting attention, being forgetful, difficulty getting organized, like all of these are really executive function skills. So I think it'd be really hard to meet criteria for ADHD without having weaknesses in executive functioning. And the thing to remember too is because executive functioning it's not like a formal disorder, there's no set criteria. So ADHD, there's a set criteria that the DSM-5, or I guess now TR since last week, the new criteria came out that didn't actually change at all, but it's the newest book. But anyway, it there's a set criteria for ADHD, but not for executive functioning issues. And even think about it, some people call it just executive functioning issues, some people call it executive dysfunction. So it's definitely important to know what you're talking about and referring to. But basically, I would view the two as like, obviously, as we were talking about earlier, you can definitely have executive functions without having ADHD. I mean, anxieties, I see quite a bit causing EF issues, depression. I mean, there's countless things that can cause it. But at least for me, I view it, if you have ADHD by default, I think I've never seen someone with ADHD that does not have executive function weaknesses.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you so much. Wendy, I've got a question for you. A parent is asking how young, nope, I'm sorry, different question. A parent is asking if this presentation would apply to seniors getting ready for college. What's your thoughts on that?
100% yes. Your children are coming out from underneath you and getting to go somewhere probably away from you, even if it's just down the street, but nonetheless, they're not going to be with you. You're not going to be able to keep tabs on them, and they need to be independent. They need to be able to regulate their schedule. They need to regulate their time. They have to learn how to prioritize. They really, to Carrie's point, really have to have steps down to get through the things that they need to do, not only every day, but through every week and through weekends, and lots of distractions and things pulling at their time that that they can easily get off track by doing, as we all know, because we've all been in college in those situations and have kids in those situations. So we see a ton of 11th and 12th graders, and many times it is the parent calling saying, my child's done really well. They've really gotten through, they've compensated, they're really smart, but they do have some executive functioning challenges, and I've been their structure, or I've been their scaffolding, and I don't know what I'm going to do when they go off to school because I can't be there anymore. And so, those kinds of students, we typically work with for maybe 6 months. Sometimes they go through longer. But for the most part, they just need to start building those routines and understanding how to prioritize and how to own their calendar. That is the most important thing I have found with older teens, getting, even the ones that we work with in college, it's the same thing. It's like the old story about the balloon. When you have a blown up balloon, and if you squeeze one end blows up and the other one might go small, so that you just have to move things around. Well, when you look at your calendar, and if you have scheduled study time one place on the calendar, but someone calls and says, I got a great party to go to, or maybe I got a great coffee house to listen to music at, you need to realize that you're squeezing that balloon and move that study time to another place. So juniors and seniors in high school, freshmen in college, this is talking directly to them, as well as the other kids. Anytime there's a transition from, for example, elementary school to middle school to high school to college, those big transitions, need to have those skills in place in order to be ready and take on that new responsibility. There's usually, more work, more expectations of the individual, and more independence that comes along with it. And executive functioning is really the foundation of the house that you're building on top of it. So you want to have strong EF skills.
Yeah, and I think also, executive functioning skills, even a child, 3 or 4, there's some aspect of, independence and being able to do things, or like early kindergarten or elementary school rather. Like think about, if there's something your child could be doing themselves or feel capable of it, whether it's getting their own water, or putting, if you pack their lunch, then putting it in their backpack or their water bottle, or for, especially since the pandemic, for those of you that have a kid that brings a Chromebook to and from school, working on having them learn to charge and unpack and repack the Chromebook themselves. These are like essentially, by doing it at a younger age and helping your kid to do it, it makes it a lot easier when they get to high school or go to college. And so not suddenly having to do this all on their own, because it's a lot harder if they have to suddenly start from scratch doing everything on their own at that point.
And building on that,
very true.
Yeah, and building on that real quick is, don't do things for your children. Realize their age and give them that independence. And it's okay if they fall down once in a while. That's how they learn. They build those new neural pathways, which Jennifer, I'm sure, and Carrie can talk about. But they build those new neural pathways by seeing their mistakes, realizing them, accepting them, and finding a new path to get to a different solution. So that starts, as Carrie said, very, very young. And, realize your child's in kindergarten. Okay, they're cute and they're little, and there's lots of things that they can't do. But there are things that they can do, and give them that opportunity to do them. Even making choices, presenting choices to children and having them go through the process of thinking about, well, what does each choice get me? And how do I make a decision? Even little decisions. Do I want to play with a friend, or do I want to watch a video game? And as the child grows, it's really important to keep doing that with them, to keep pushing them to be independent, make those choices. I think it's really important, and I'm going to shoot this back to Deborah or to Jennifer, understanding how we build neural pathways and understand how we figure out the right path to go on. And I think that parents understanding that it's a process is partly what is most important in understanding why you don't want to do too many things for your kids.
Yeah, I definitely want to hand this over to Dr. Reisman. I just want to follow up, though, on what you and Carrie have been talking about, because as a mom, I know many times it's just quicker, easier, faster for me to do it. It's like, yep, he could tie his shoes, but you know what? We're trying to get out the door. Let's just get this done. But you're absolutely right. The moms I work with, we work on the same thing. Having, buffering that time in to really allow for what may take a little bit longer, but what in the long run really is going to serve your child better. And really it's going to serve you, because as they develop and learn how to make these decisions for themselves, they run to you less when decisions have to be made. So I love that y'all shared that. But yes, Dr. Reisman, I want to follow up with a couple of questions. One thing I want to ask is, one of the parents is asking, how young is reasonable to recognize ADHD in a child? And then if you could also then follow up with what Wendy was saying about the pathways in the brain as well.
Yeah. So I just want to recognize that there are parents out there. You all are the best observers and you know your children best, hands down. I think we all on this panel recognize that. And so I think that parents are going to be the first to say, whoa, my child has, a really hard time putting the brakes on, and they're going to be the first to notice that. So I think it's not unusual, even sometimes when we get into, situations like preschool or daycare, where perhaps there's a little bit more routine and structure being put on our children. And when some children are struggling with that, so it is not uncommon for children to present to their pediatrician, developmental pediatrician, or even to a developmental neuropsychologist or a psychologist with a question of ADHD as young as 3-4 years old. Certainly making sure that you've got someone who's comfortable in addressing that question and really just sitting down and saying, what are we seeing right here and what are we not, to make sure that we're not confusing different things and that we're not maybe misattributing anything to ADHD when it's not, when it is typical development. So being able to reach out to trusted professionals like your pediatrician or a good developmental neuropsychologist is really key, because we can make differential diagnoses as young as 2 or 3 years old. That's something that can be done. We don't need to wait if we've got concerns about our children. That's one thing that I do want to express there. But in terms of kind of what do we do in terms of helping those healthy brains develop with those EF skills? And I want to go back to something that Lynn said earlier when she said, these are skills that develop up until we're in our 20s. We should all be cheering that, right? Because there's nowhere, but we have to go here, but up and improved, right? We've got skills, we've got things that we can do. And when people ask me, is there, an online program I should be doing, or is there something like that? I say, you know what? A lot of it is real life. And I know Lynn can talk about it, the Unstuck and Untarget curriculum. It really is real life. It's teaching our children to make a plan A and make a plan B. It's working with coaches on managing your calendar. It's making sure that your child has a good morning routine or a nighttime or a wind down routine or a checklist. Because I can tell you that when we see children master a checklist or master a routine, it's really something to see, especially when those same kids then turn around and tell their parents, hey, you forgot a step or you missed a step. Then, wow, we've really, mastered something here. If we've taught our children a framework for how to approach different things, even if it's just saying, I think I need a checklist. Because some kids really just need a checklist. And once they've got it, they can conquer anything, but they need to have that framework that they need to do. And that helps our brains. When we think about what helps our brains, it's real life experience and it's real-time feedback too, which is where parents get into it, is being able to know, when do I correct and provide some positive coaching support? Or when do I let, kind of step back and let that natural consequence happen so that we can have a discussion point later?
Yeah, I wanted to
this is
piggyback.
rich. Please.
I was just going to piggyback on what Jennifer was saying and what Wendy and Carrie were speaking about earlier in this trajectory from the very young age, and then what can we start to do with our youngest learners all the way up through college. And I think it's that thinking about, okay, where do I back up to give independence? And for me, that question is, where do I find myself repeating myself a lot? Okay, that's somewhere where I need to put some sort of supportive strategy in. And as Jennifer suggested, the checklist is a beautiful place where you can say, all right, this is a morning routine we've worked through. I know you're independent in these skills in isolation. And when I'm there reminding you, now let's take one step back. What can we do so that you can own this process and this routine on your own? And the easiest way to do that is to put it in writing and to write it down. So then it's something that the child is following independently and they're taking ownership of it. And then moving back from that is when the child gets to create the checklist on their own, they get to make priorities and think about what is most important for me to get done, before I get out the door in the morning. Oh, I really want to make sure that I've got some screen time before I leave for school. Okay, well, what are the things I need to prioritize to get that in so I can still get to school on time? Just kind of backing up and thinking about where can I, when I remove my support, and put something else in place that will then foster this independence.
And that's a really good, important point. And to sort of add to that, the other thing to also think about is like modeling good sort of executive function skills yourself, because, kids are going to watch what you're doing. So if you think about, like, let's say your child tells you or asks you, remind me of X, Y, or Z, instead of just saying, one thought would be, if they want me to remind them about it, what am I going to do to remember? But then take a step back and have that direct them to work on a way to remind themselves. But basically by having them watch you, they might pick up on, oh, let me use Amazon Echo and set a reminder. Let me get a sheet of paper out and put a note next to the front door. Whether it's a tech thing or non-tech thing, just kids and teens are very observant. And so if you can sort of do this stuff well yourself, it often helps them, and they'll pick it, especially if you have a kid who's very resistant to doing stuff. If you try to force it on them, it's going to be a lot harder. Like being collaborative with them in problem solving in the first place, but also they may be more interested if they're watching you do it rather than you sort of even saying anything. They just sort of pick it up naturally over time to some degree too.
Yeah, normalizing
that
those
is so
support
great.
strategies.
I love the checklist. I know that really helped in our house because it removed me from being the nagger, right? Did you do this? No. Did you do it? So it kind of removed me, and I could very easily just say, make sure you check your list. I want to go play with friends. All right. Did you check your list? Are you got everything done? And then the other thing that really helped in my home too, I would love for someone to speak on this, is we used a timer, because I found that these open-ended time frames of having to do homework or having to do a chore, just like it felt like torture for this particular child, like, oh, but letting them know, okay, we're going to set the timer. When this buzzes, you're done. Do you agree? Could that be helpful? Anyone can answer.
So I'm happy to jump in, but I know everybody's going to have an opinion that's the same on this. Basically, the bottom line is timers are the greatest things, visual timers. I'm a huge fan of the time timer. I looked on my desk to grab one. It's not right on my desk, so I could show everyone, but cannot say enough. Go on Amazon, buy a time timer. And remember that it does two things. One, it blocks time so your child knows exactly how much time they have left, because it visually shows that the time is going away. But at the same time, it also shows them they can push themselves to focus a little bit longer. So the latest studies show that children between 0 and 20 years old can focus on one thing for 1 minute at a time per their age. So if you have a 15-year-old and you're getting 15 minutes of strict focus on one thing, non-distracted, you're doing well. And we want them to learn how to push that. So when you have the time timer and they can see, say they set it for 35 minutes, they're doing something for 35 minutes. And at 30 minutes, they're starting to like, oh, I don't like this, or oh, maybe I have to go to the bathroom, or maybe I need a water or to sharpen my pencil. They can look and say, I've only got 3 more minutes. I can push through. I can make this. And then they can do the same thing when they take a break. So I'm going to take a 5-minute break. I'm going to stretch. I'm going to do something to give my brain a break for a minute, and they can set that timer and they know exactly when it goes off, that they go back into doing what they need to do. So I can't say enough about having a time timer, whether it's the Pomodoro timer or the time timer, or, there's even ones on your timer on your iPhone. So with that, I'll let everybody else voice in on this.
The one thing I wanted to add to that is I want to credit Sarah Ward, who's a wonderful speech pathologist and executive function guru herself, is she devised a strategy where you take a timer and Crate & Barrel sells these, there's all sorts of clocks that you can get with this function. And what you do is you take a dry erase marker, and let's say you've got half an hour before you need to leave for practice, and you've got homework you've got to get done. You've got these 2 things you need to get done for school, but you really also want to get in some, FaceTime with your best friend. So you block off, you shade in that half hour, and you decide, oh, I'd really like 10 minutes of FaceTime with my friend. So that leaves me with 20 minutes for my homework. So then once it's shaded in, you can watch that progression of time. And if I can stay focused, I'm going to maximize that FaceTime, and maybe I'll even get a little bit more because I'm super efficient. If I dawdle, I take a few extra breaks, I can't stay focused, I'm going to watch that natural consequences, that FaceTime opportunity is going to shrink too, because I've really got to get out the door for practice. So it's a really lovely, beautiful, easy to use way of structuring time and prioritizing those things you want to get done in a space.
Yeah, and that's a great strategy. Yeah, I was actually thinking about that too. There's also, I think she made it, there's a 360 thinking app that I believe she created. It's the same idea. Basically, it's on a clock, but it's quite, I use a lot, it was an iPad. But basically it, with the clock, it has the different colors on the app version. So you basically have, I guess it's like the yellow phase is like the kind of getting started. And then you have like the green is like the main part, and then the red is when you're finishing up. So it's kind of like if you're thinking about when I don't know, let's say your child has 30 minutes electronics time. So what happens when the 30 minutes is up? Does that mean that they should start getting ready to end, or does that mean it really should already be off, or like they've disconnected. So the idea is like that 5-minute, wind down period is sort of teaches them to, over time, to prepare. So the idea of like when the time's up, they can immediately be disconnected, not suddenly start packing up or doing whatever they need to do next.
That's really good. Yeah, I found that giving warnings instead of saying you have to stop playing the game now, but saying, okay, you got 15 minutes, so that it doesn't seem like this cold hard stop, because that would tend to kind of incite a mini riot at times. But we've got a couple more questions from parents. So this first question says, I think what it's saying is, my child studies hard, but the subject matter does not stick. Should we consider that maybe this is executive functioning? Anybody?
I'm happy
Yes,
to
Dr.
mention
Eastman.
that. I think that anytime we see our children putting in an inordinate amount of effort into a subject and we're not seeing the performance output out there, that's a great time to go and reconnect with the teacher, talk with a pediatrician and talk about whether or not it's time to go see somebody for an evaluation, because there's a number of things that could be at play depending on the age of the child. Are we talking about a learning disability in a particular subject that hasn't been identified and diagnosed? Or are we talking about some executive functioning difficulties that maybe need some really targeted support? And the great thing is, I hope that everybody out there listens and hears today, is that there's a ton of hope, right? No matter what, our executive functioning skills are going to improve and get better. So it's going to get better. And trust me, you're not going to go off to college with these children, but there's a couple of things that we can do along the way. And so finding out and getting to the root of that, I think, is really important, so that you can make sure that you're paired up with the right strategies, because obviously telling your child just to study harder is really frustrating as a parent and with a child in that situation. I also just want to mention that one of the things that we're seeing in clinic a lot now is that over the past 2 years, when children's educational routines have been disrupted, that question is harder and harder to answer. And so I just want to recognize that and say that it is a challenging situation to be in as a parent, to say, are they just behind because they didn't get, and maybe my child really didn't benefit from virtual learning, and so now they're in a classroom and expected to just pick up where they left off. That can be a really challenging situation. And so it can be important to get some objective feedback to find out what is really going on, because we don't want children with learning disabilities to not have the interventions that they need so that they can be as successful as possible. And so it makes that job of a parent a little bit harder right now.
And I just want to jump in on that too and add that, don't forget, a lot of schools are trying to get a lot of different curriculum through, and they don't teach study skills. Right. They don't teach your kids how to study and how to work towards that point where the night before all you're doing is reviewing, because it's already been built into your short and long-term memory through other things you've done. So, an executive functioning coach, sometimes teachers can do it. Some teachers are great at this, but that's where an executive functioning coach really can come in. Even if there's not a learning difference, we work with both obviously with learning differences and not, but to really understand that your child just may not know how to study. And studying for math is obviously a lot different than studying for history, and figuring those things out and what's the best way to study. So, study skills is definitely an area that people are lacking, where someone like a coach could come in. But also I wanted to add on, because you mentioned about the pandemic, I did want to say, Carrie said this earlier, and I think actually everyone sort of mentioned it at this point, but there's a lot of kids with anxiety and depression, way more than there were before 2 years ago. And there's two things that have also happened as a side effect with that. And that is self-confidence is down. A lot of kids are questioning, okay, well, now I can't do this, and the kid next to me can do it. And why am I so anxious? And why am I scared of COVID? Or all these different things that come into it. So, really, it's important to realize that just because your child's struggling in one of these executive function areas doesn't necessarily mean they have a diagnosis of a learning difference. It could just be as a result of what's going on with the anxiety and depression. And a lot of times having someone one-on-one work with them, show that they care, and really help beef up their confidence to say, it's, it's okay. Let me show you another way to approach this, or let's talk through this. That can really help your kids. And if you're still in that space where your kids will talk to you and listen to you, I highly recommend that one-on-one time, even if it's not formal, sitting at a table doing homework. But driving in the car is always a great time to talk to your kids and say, hey, I noticed that you're having trouble in this class. Let's talk about it. Like, how are things going? And try to bring it up in a very comfortable setting so they don't feel like you're being negative with them or that you're concerned about the grade, but instead you're concerned about them and how can you support them better. So I just wanted to add that as a side note, because confidence has really suffered, which also leads to maybe lesser grades and maybe seemingly like there's subject matter gaps. There's so much that's happened with that. I'm not a psychologist, that those on the phone that are can speak much more to what's happened during the pandemic, but it's just been a really big area we focus a lot on lately. Self-esteem, self-confidence. It's okay to be scared. Let's talk about what our fears are with school in particular and how do we move through those. So I just wanted to add that for parents.
No, that's really good. We can't minimize the impact that the pandemic has had on our kids. We can't minimize that. Lynn, I'm going to let you speak, but I'm also going to give you a question. So after you give your comment, I'd love for you to speak to this question. What are some good ways to differentiate when kids need positive coaching and feedback, or when we should let them feel the result of natural consequences?
Well, so I was just going to piggyback real quickly on what Wendy had said. And I think that oftentimes, students, especially ones that have always done well, or, things have come naturally, and then they hit a place in their education where things feel more overwhelming or it's harder to balance. And the use of some of these strategies may feel like there's something wrong. And I think that goes back to a little bit what Carrie said earlier, that if we can model our own use of these strategies, and that we all need executive function supports at one time or another, or that when we see our child struggling, we say, hey, I've got a strategy that I use all the time. Let's see if it can help us in this moment, and just offering it up in that kind of really easy breezy kind of way. I think, it just normalizes that these are things that we all benefit from wherever we are in our executive function development trajectory. So, and speaking of executive functions, Deborah, can you repeat that question for me one more time?
Yes, no worries. It says, what are some good ways to differentiate when kids need positive coaching or feedback, or when we should just kind of take our hands off and let whatever's going to happen, happen?
So it's an excellent question. And I think my overwhelming piece of advice is to keep it positive. And one of the best tools that we have in our bag of tricks for improving skill sets is to reinforce using our positive language. There's research out there to suggest that we should give 4 pieces of positive reinforcement or praise to every 1 piece of corrective feedback that we give. And so the more that we can encourage by saying, this is what we want to see, and this is what we're excited to see when our kids perform skills, the better. That being said, there are times when we learn through natural consequences. And so my piece of advice there would be, if it's a skill that we've practiced and it's something that I know my kiddo can do, and we know we've got the supports in the right place, and we can identify that, all right, if we can get these things done, this is the consequence. If these things don't get done, this is the consequence. Once those things are outlined and and everybody's on the same page about what that looks and feels like, let the chips fall as they may, because those consequences are what we've identified them to be, either in the way that we wanted them to go or not. If it continually happens, I think that's a time then we need to step back and say, all right, do we have the right supports in place? Is there something that I thought was an independent skill and isn't, or we need an extra strategy for? But there's definitely that opportunity once, the plan has been set and the consequences, both positive and negative, have been outlined, that it's okay to let the natural consequences be a reality. Forgetting homework, or, a piece of equipment for practice, you may have to run a couple extra sprints. Let's think of a strategy that'll make sure that we've got that lacrosse stick next time we head out the door. I think
that's where the evening and the morning routines come in, and they're crucial. Carrie, I definitely want to get you in on this. I also want to add to whatever it is you're going to say. Someone's asking about medication. We have a couple of parents that have asked, when are we thinking about medication? What medication should we be thinking about? And then the other piece and the other side of that, I guess, another parent is asking, what about visual strategies, right? So someone's asking about medication, someone's asking for visual strategies at home. Can you speak to both of those for us, Carrie?
Sure. Yeah, and what I was going to say about the we were talking about before about the consequences is just one thing else to keep in mind is that if the natural consequences are not going to be meaningful for the child or teen, like that's just something to keep in mind and like another way to differentiate it in terms of how helpful the natural consequences will be. But in general, in terms of medication, obviously prefacing this as a psychologist, I don't prescribe medication. But I mean, like anytime your child or teen is struggling with something, you want to figure out like how significant is it and what options exist to help. And so medication alone often is not sufficient. I mean, first of all, though, to back up though, like medication, by this, I probably assume you're referring more to ADHD, like in meds probably is the most common one. Because, for executive function deficit, part of the problem is if you don't know what's causing it, it's hard to fix. You can't really target medication as something you don't know what the cause is. Because if you have someone that is having executive function issues because of anxiety, that's probably a very different approach to medication and behaviorally than you would do with someone who had it because of ADHD. So like you want to first figure out what is actually causing the executive function issues in the first place. But if, let's say, you do the behavior strategies and it's not sufficient, then, in some cases, medication certainly can be helpful. It's not going to, like, if we're talking about stimulants, it's not going to magically give you these executive function or organizational skills. It's going to it may often make it easier to implement strategies and like tools that you have at your disposal. And it may help to some degree with this getting over the hump of getting started, but it's not going to give you all these skills that we're talking about. So it can be helpful, like in addition to everything else, but not by itself in most cases.
Thank you. Dr. Reisman, let me get your take on the meds. And also if you could speak to this question. A parent is asking, my daughter went to an AMS Montessori school. The corrective issues the guests are addressing sound like the Montessori concept. And are any of you familiar with the Montessori concept? So if you could speak to the concept as well as what Carrie was just talking about, medication.
Great. So I'm just going to say aloud that I'm going to talk a little bit about medication first. And so I will say that one of the things I love about working where I work at Chesapeake is working with some lovely child psychiatry experts, because I think anytime we're talking about our children and medication management, we want to make sure that we're connected to the right professionals. So obviously having a great relationship and consultation with your pediatrician can be key, or a developmental pediatrician. And then if we're talking about medications for attentional issues, I think it's really good to get a fantastic consultation with someone who really knows child psychiatry so you can get all of your questions answered. Because if we're talking about medication, that's one thing that I want to make sure all parents are empowered with. Go with all of your questions, bring them all. People really like to answer them because we know so much more than we knew just 10 or 20 years ago about the effects of medication, what we should be looking for, and how much they can truly help many children. Are they for every single child? No. And that's why it's really important to get a consultation, because it can be life-changing for many children that we've seen. About Montessori, so full disclosure, I'm a Montessori child myself, and my mom was a Montessori teacher, so very familiar with Montessori methods, and we have a lot of fantastic Montessori schools in our area. And one thing that we do know that a lot of things about the Montessori method are really fantastic at teaching aspects of self-regulation. And I think that's something that we see in a lot of schools where they've kind of borrowed methods to help teach children about self-regulation by learning to walk upon a line, or learning to do things quietly, or learning how to use aspects of the environment and preparing them and kind of following a pattern to which to do tasks is really helpful. And I think that's what a lot of our fantastic executive functioning coaches do somewhat intuitively and naturally to help, especially our littlest children, develop some of those early executive functioning skills. So I think that's definitely a thing where we can all learn from each other, and whatever works to help our kids develop these skills is fantastic. And the Montessori method has a lot of wonderful things that we can do to help teach children a little bit more about self-regulation.
Very helpful. This is really great. We're at 8:20. We like to keep these around an hour. So I'd like to go round robin. I'm gonna ask this last question, and I'd love for each of you to speak to it as best you can. Obviously, we have parents watching that have little ones, and then we've got parents that have high school and even beyond. So just do the best that you can in providing them some great information. Any short-term, long-term planning tools. This parent is asking for kids going into high school. Lynn, I think you were the one that spoke to these transition moments, or maybe it was Wendy. I'm sorry,
Wendy, yeah.
I'm not sure, but someone spoke about the transition moments, and the parent even gives an example. For high schoolers, they'll be juggling 5, 6, or 7 subjects, short-term assignments, long-term papers that they have, a few months to work on. But I'd like to really leave the parents this evening with something in their hand that they can actually begin doing. So Lynn, I'm going to start with you. And then when you finish, just pass it on to whoever you'd like until everyone gets an opportunity.
Well, that's a big question. I have so many different directions I would like to take that. I think if I could say one overarching thing with executive function strategies, it would be to write it down. And I say that from a lot of different angles. So we think about the emotional regulation state. And when we become flooded with emotion, one of the hardest things for our brain to do is to process language. So when we're faced with, a child who's really struggling in that way, writing a message that just says, hey, want to try this strategy, or hey, I'm here as soon as you want to talk about what's going on. A really nice strategy. We've talked a lot about checklists. It's taking all of those things that we need to remember to get from point A to point B, and we're putting them down on a piece of paper. And it gives us complete flexibility and complete ownership of what that list looks like. I would say that one of my all-time favorite strategies that comes out of Unstuck and Untarget is Goal, Why, Plan, Do, Check. And this is a strategy that incorporates every single domain of executive function, because it looks at goal setting and whatever that goal might be. It looks at the why, which is what's the motivation to me to get this goal accomplished. It allows me to make a plan for what that's going to look like to accomplish that goal. Most importantly, then I'm also going to create a plan B, because so many times our plan A goes off the rails, and we're going to need that plan B in our back pocket to make sure it happens. And then there's the check. That's that self-reflection to say, hey, did my plan work out? And do I need to readjust my goal, or do I need a whole new plan to get to that goal? So for me, it would be writing things down. And it can be our strategy in all of these different ways to support executive function skills.
So do you mind if I jump in on that? So taking
yes,
what Lynn
please.
said and enrich and sort of just enriching what she said, totally agree, writing it down. We have something we call plannering, which involves a plan or agenda, whatever you want to call it. Some schools have their own, some kids have their own, but most importantly, it is that vehicle that Lynn just talked about to write things down in. So if you're going to go from middle school to high school, or even elementary to middle school where you have multiple subjects, the example that was given, for example, you have what I look at as multiple bosses with all of them have different priorities on their work, which is usually number one, but they're all different, and you have to figure out what to do first, get things in on time. You have long, short-term, medium-term projects. Get an agenda. First thing you want to do is, when you get the agenda, is you want to go through and mark when all the due dates are. And you want to circle them or put a cloud around them or star them so you know when things are due. And then you want to sit down and work backwards from those due dates to give yourself what we call self-assigned homework, which is what are the things that you have to do along the way to meet the deadlines that you have, that are hard deadlines that have been given to you. When do you have to have drafts done? When do you have to have research done? Break it down. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Break that elephant down into one piece at a time and write it all down so that you can manage it in your agenda. And then every day when you get new assignments, to Lynn's point, whether it's given in school or through a portal, there should be a process that you write it all down. And you should double check that every day. And remember, if you have 7 subjects, every subject should have something written next to it, even if it's none, so that you know what you have to do every night. And as you get closer to those tests or homework being due, and you have multiple things due in a row, what we have is the kids actually annotate different annotations for those things. So the due date is a circle, but we have study with stars all around it, for example, for the couple days before, and we want things crossed out, just like that checklist as you finish things. So it's really having a tool to manage your planner, and the planner is so important. And I want to just give real quick a couple of planners that we like. The Bulletproof Planner, I think, is a great planner if you have kids that struggle with time management in general. It takes over, you can look at their whole day. But for those of you who also just have school planners, or the kids are like, yeah, right, you're so old, Mom, I'm not using a planner, give me something electronic, I want to share these. There's something called Todoist, Todoist. There's another app called Things. There's another one called I Studied, and it's IEZ at the end, I Studies, and I Homework. And those are great apps if the kids want to start or insist on being electronic. At the end of the day, I'm wholeheartedly in sync with Lynn. Write it down. There is something about the process of writing it down that it writes in your brain that is very different than using an app. But there are those kids that push back. So that's my advice, is really get a plannering tool.
That's fantastic. I would have my son write it down and say it as he was writing it. I found that the more of his senses that he involved in what he was doing, the more he was inclined to actually remember. And then for someone asked about visually, we actually had a huge month at a glance, like a big sticky on his wall. And so he had that whole month to be able to see what was due that month. And then behind it, of course, was the next month. But visually, that really helped him, because at a glance, he could really look and go, okay, in 2 weeks, I have this paper due. So I better figure out, what's the plan to get it done. Really helpful, Lynn and Wendy. Dr.
One more
would
thing.
you
For
like
parents who want to learn more about time management, we actually recently did a presentation that was recorded, and you can go to illuminos.co/parent resources, and they're free, and they're titled very clearly. So if you want to watch the one we recently did on executive functioning skills to help parents at home immediately, there's lots of tips and tricks in there. And if you have any questions, shout out. Also, happy to share worksheets and other things we use every day. It's just tough in this quick forum to do all of that, but reach out if anybody needs that.
Awesome. Dr. Reisman, I'll let you go. And then Carrie, I'll have you kind of close us out with your thoughts around this. How does that sound?
Absolutely.
Great.
You heard some fantastic ideas about the very structured things that you can do for that high schooler or that middle schooler who's juggling a whole bunch of different subjects. The one thing that I would also encourage is to think about some different S's that we can do for overall brain health. And that would be attending to, what does our sleep look like? What does our sugar look like? And how much screens have we consumed today? And so one of the things, just in talking about good brain health, our executive functioning skills are extremely sensitive to when we haven't gotten good sleep. So making sure that we've set up our evening so that our child has enough time to get a good night's rest is one of the best things that we can do as a parent. It's not fun, right? But it's actually something that's going to really pay off. And then in terms of sugar, making sure that our kids are not in that sugar rush or sugar crash, and that they're not hangry when we're trying to get them to study, that they've had something good into their body and had good fuel for them throughout the day, is going to make a big difference in terms of how well they'll be able to go through that plannering process, the studying process, checking off their list of things to do. And then also, what's our screen consumption been like? We know that our brains get fed with a whole bunch of hits of dopamine when we've been scrolling or we've been doing something else. And that does not bode well for being able to have that focused attention, that 15 minutes of time that we need to. So the more we can just be mindful of that, and perhaps make sure that we've got some screen-free time, going to be really helpful for our children. And those are just kind of those underlying safety net skills to develop some of our executive functioning skills, and tag teaming off of those great tips that we just got.
Great. Well, I guess certainly you guys have shared some really great things. I would say to maybe just add a little bit to that. I agree, definitely writing everything in one place. I think the biggest takeaways I would say to think about for those of you listening is one size does not fit all, as I said at the beginning, and that's really true. Some people like paper planner, some like electronic planners. There's various options, but you want to figure out what is your child or team willing to use. So the goal is keep track of assignments. There's obviously more than one way to do that. I would say just to think about in terms of electronic options, some other ones to think about either as the main system, or if, let's say, they write in the paper planner at school and transfer when they get home, would be there's an app called TickTick. It's similar to Todoist in a lot of ways, but it actually has a built-in Pomodoro timer, which is kind of cool, and some other habit tracking features. That would be one thing to keep in mind. In general, for those of you, I mean, almost most schools have a school portal. You can a lot of times sync the assignments and export them, or sync them to an external calendar or any taskless program that lets you sync with a calendar. So it's a nice automated way to keep track of assignments, especially if you're using a program that allows you to organize in a certain way. Like, there's still definitely a benefit of writing it down, but for some kids, if they have a hard time, like if it's too taxing to think, I'm not going to write this all down, but if it's there and they can click buttons and move stuff into a slot for the night to work on, that could make it easier. The other big thing I would say that we may have touched this a little bit, but like when you're thinking about a plan, in order to figure out if it's realistic, you have to know how long assignments are going to take or estimate. And so you really want to make sure that your child or teen is getting the habit of estimating how long things are going to take. And one of the best ways to also improve estimations is to actually track the time. There's an app called Toggl, for example, where you can type the name of assignment, click start, pause, stop, and then it's done. And then you get a nice, I guess you can print out if you want to, or it's on however you view it, a graph chart. You can see. So if, let's say, you're reading a textbook and it's the same, each chapter is about the same amount of pages. If you track how long 1 or 2 chapters take, you probably have a pretty good sense roughly of how long the next few chapters will be. So it makes it a lot easier to decide when you make your list of all your assignments for the night, before you even start, is the plan actually realistic? Because if you have 2 hours for homework and your estimated plan is going to be 5 hours, clearly there's a problem. So like thinking about accurate estimation and planning will definitely help to make plans more realistic, and in turn also motivate children and teens to actually use plans and make them more in the first place.
Thank you so much. You guys, this was so helpful. I think that this is going to be one of those events that we've done that parents are going to come back to over and over again to watch. They're going to tell other parents about it. And we would love for parents to continue putting up their questions. We would love to ask each of you, the panel guests, to please check this thread from time to time on our Facebook page and provide the answers to the parents as they're coming in, because we've reached our closing time. Carrie, someone is asking about a boot camp that you do. Is there a boot camp? I think Wendy kind of shared it with us, but can you tell us a little bit more about it, or how people,
Sure.
And I'm already being told questions are still coming in. So
sure, yeah.
if the
I do
panelists
an
would
executive
come
function
back.
boot camp. It's basically the main one is a 2-hour either individual or small group session. It's really focused on figuring out what are the things we want to work on. So keeping better track of assignments, planning, organizing, study skills to some degree, focusing on chores. Like, it doesn't just have to be school stuff. It's executive function skills obviously run the gamut. And so the idea is, by gaining greater awareness, looking, working together, come up with a plan and writing it out, it allows people to have an opportunity to jumpstart or fine-tune executive function skills. Obviously, you can't fix everything in 2 hours, and the follow-through is often the hardest, but by starting with the planning, it can make it easier then to work after on the follow-through. And in terms of questions on that, it's all on my hellerpsychologygroup.com is my website, and there's information there, or feel free to email me from the website as well.
Wonderful. And I think we're going to have everyone's contact information in the comments. So if you want to reach out to any of these amazing executive function and in some cases ADHD professionals and experts, please do that. And as a parent who waited longer, I mean, my son got through college, the ride was bumpy, but he's now in law school. He's doing great. But don't wait. I guess that would be my one of, if you kind of have an inkling that something just doesn't seem to be right, don't wait. Go ahead and get the resources that you can. Everyone here is offering some type of free resource on their website. So please take advantage of that. And then if you're ready to go the next step, please reach out to them individually. Again, we'd love to invite the panelists to answer any questions that come in after this live ends. But thank each of you so much. Thank you for Washington Parent for giving us this platform and opportunity to have this discussion, and to all of our background tech people who have gotten those Facebook questions here into the Zoom chat for us to answer. So everyone, thank you for being here. We've enjoyed it, and we'd love to have you all back sometime. So we'll look forward to maybe doing a part 2. Okay, good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.